Hello everyone, and welcome to your complete and ultimate Chiori guide. I've been playing Chiori for the past few days, testing her kit and teams, and thus this video is to hopefully guide any current or future Chiori owners on how to roughly build and play her. As usual with my guides, this will cover all of the following in order: general playstyle, talent overview, weapon options, artifact sets and stats, team comps, constellation overview, and then a team showcase with my thoughts on Chiori, all in an as condensed manner as possible. Chapters are provided, so please navigate to whichever part of the video you need. As a disclaimer, this is not my personal account with my own builds. As such, a lot of the team and character performance is not a full representation of their damage potential, so just keep that in mind. With all of that out of the way, let's get right into the guide. Chiori is a sub-DPS archetype focused on doing off-field damage with her elemental skill while paired with Geo teammates. Similar to Albedo, Chiori is at her best when supporting a Geo DPS. She has high damage multipliers, which means damage is not going to be an issue, and she scales well with vertical investment. If you have or are at all familiar with Albedo's gameplay, Chiori is very much just a direct upgrade from him, with a very similar playstyle and team setups, albeit a little bit more restrictive at Constellation 0. Chiori is a split scaling character, which means she benefits from both attack and defense stats. This will carry over to her weapon options and her teammates, as she can take advantage of buffs from characters like Bennett and Goro simultaneously. Chiori primarily being an off-fielder might make her seem like she would be a very flexible character, but she does have one major drawback, being that at Constellation 0, she needs to be played with another Geo character that can create constructs. This heavily hampers her team comps, as without a Geo construct, she will lose out on nearly half of her damage output, which is pretty massive. This makes Chiori a little bit free-to-play unfriendly, as without her Constellation 1, you will need units like Zhongli, Albedo, or Itto if you want to play her in multiple teams. Chiori's biggest strength is that she's definitely a direct upgrade in terms of damage in many Geo teams, something that is quite rare now. However, the trade-off is that she likely will only be tied to those teams, as her kit is a little bit restrictive, while also not providing any extra value over other sub-DPSs in non-Geo team comps. Chiori is and can be a good character, but only if your teams allow her to be in them. Chiori's normal attack is pretty unexceptional, dealing physical damage. However, she does gain infusion if you use her elemental skill without swapping to a different character, but unless you have her at C6, even the infused normal attacks won't be doing that much damage anyways, which makes it very hard to justify using Chiori as the on-field DPS. As such, for most people, I do not recommend leveling this talent. Chiori's elemental skill makes up the bulk of her damage, and so there's a lot to go over. When cast, Chiori will slash a nearby opponent and summon her doll, Tamoto, on the field. Tamoto will stay on the field for a total of 17 seconds and attack an enemy every 3.6 seconds, which means that it will deal a total of 5 instances of damage over the course of its field time. You can also hold her skill to adjust where Chiori slashes, similar to Qingce and Alhaitham's skills. Both the Slash and Tamoto's attacks actually have pretty decent damage multipliers, which means Chiori does actually do pretty good damage. However, this skill does not snapshot buffs, which means you likely won't get much mileage out of buffing Chiori if you play her off-field. Tamoto will stay in its current position and will not follow Chiori or the active character around, so the only way to reposition Tamoto is to cast her skill again, which can be a bit annoying against enemies that move around a lot. Tamoto will generate 1 geoparticle every time it hits an enemy, which means it generates a total of 5 geoparticles over the course of its field time. This skill has a 16-second cooldown, which means that if you can time your rotations well, Tamoto can have 100% uptime. After using this skill, if any of your team members summon a Geo construct, a second Tamoto will be summoned on the field as well. This is important as it effectively doubles Chiori's damage output and also means that she has to be played with another Geo team member for her maximum damage potential, at least at Constellation 0. This will be brought up again in the team section. As stated here, you can only have a maximum of 1 additional Tamoto, which means that you can only have 2 Tamotos on the field at any given time. Now, I'm also going to lump in her A1 passive, as it's completely tied to her skill as well. When you cast a skill, Chiori briefly enters a unique state for about 1 second. In this time, Chiori can do one of 2 things. If you don't do anything, Chiori will gain Geo infusion on her normal, charge, and plunge attacks for 5 seconds. I don't recommend doing this though, as her normal attacks even when infused do not do that much damage, at least outside of her C6. The second option is to cast a skill again, which immediately swaps her to the next character in your party lineup. This means that your team order does actually matter when playing Chiori if you want her to swap into a specific character, more often than not being your main DPS. Doing this also makes Tamoto deal coordinated geo damage up to a maximum of twice with the same damage multiplier as a skill slash each. This is actually quite a lot of extra damage, and so should more often than not be the option to use. One unique thing about this skill is that if you held Chiori's skill upwards and recast it while in mid-air, she will still swap characters. As far as I'm aware, this is the first and only time a character has allowed us to swap teammates mid-air, which makes Chiori quite unique. Though I can't say this is very useful, as I haven't found any situation where this has necessarily been a net benefit. Regardless, just remember that if you play an off-field Chiori and want to maximize that damage, you should always opt for casting her skill again. However, for the few of you who play an on-field and or C6 Chiori, staying on Chiori becomes your preferred option for her Geo infusion. And finally, for Chiori's Elemental Burst, Chiori will unleash a slice that deals geo damage in a decently wide AoE. The multiplier is decently high, and this does have a low energy cost of only 50 energy, but is pretty unexceptional overall and doesn't also do anything special. Regarding her talent priority, as you might be able to guess, her skill is by far the most important talent to level, followed loosely by her burst, and then lastly her auto attacks. I'd say if you don't plan to use Chiori on field at all, you might as well just leave her auto attack talent at level 1 and just save the resources. And then on to passive talents, Chiori's A1 was already mentioned in the skill portion, so I won't bring that up again, while her A4 gives her an additional 20% geo damage bonus if you summon a geo construct. Pretty straightforward stuff. Now, I don't normally bring up exploration passives, but Chiori has one of the best exploration passives in the game, granting a team-wide movement speed bonus if any of them are wearing a unique wind glider. This passive does not work in Domains or in Spiral Abyss, but at the time of this video, Chiori is the only character with such a passive, and makes her really good for those who decide to use her in the overworld. Alright, now that we've gone over her kit, let's go over her weapon options. Starting with her obvious best in slot, the Uraku Misugiri is going to be her top pick as her signature weapon, giving 88 crit value while increasing her normal attack, skill damage, and defense by a decent amount. Because Chiori can proc this with her doll, she has 100% uptime on this weapon's passive as it works off-field. While all of this is pretty obvious stuff, I do want to mention that this signature weapon does outperform her other options by a pretty large margin. Not to mention her 4-star weapons are very limited, so if you really like Chiori and don't mind spending the extra pulls, this weapon is a very large upgrade over even the next option. And speaking of the next option, I think it's to no one's surprise that the Jade Cutter is pretty up there. It provides a ton of attack which Chiori does still utilize thanks to her split scaling, while the massive crit rate allows her to build a lot more flexibly. The main caveat with this weapon is that due to the massive crit rate substat and Chiori also ascending with crit rate, it will make it a bit harder to balance your substats so that you don't overcap. Just from her ascension and the weapon substat alone, you're going to have over 63% crit, but as long as you don't go over 100%, you'll be good. In general, other weapons like the Mistsplitter or Lo-Fi will still be good, but you will really just be using them as pure stat sticks at that point because the passives are not really that meaningful. I'd just like to briefly touch on the Mistsplitter though, since Chiori can technically get all 3 stacks of this weapon's passive, but because Chiori usually remains off-field and doesn't cast her burst that often, the actual uptime of this passive will be very short. Not to mention her skill does not snapshot as well, which is why you'll end up losing out against the Jade Cutter. If you have a spare Mistsplitter, this will be fine, but I think you're better off putting the Mistsplitter on someone more meaningful like Bennett or Qingce. For Chiori's 4-star options, I like to say that she doesn't exactly have the widest weapon selection. For those of you who buy the Battle Pass, the Wolf Fang is a pretty good option, giving crit rate and elemental skill damage, which is pretty much exactly what Chiori needs. This is a really good choice for Chiori, but it's expensive to refine as you need to buy 5 Battle Passes to get it to Refinement 5. The next 2 options, however, are old weapons that are no longer obtainable anymore. Firstly, we have the Cinnabar Spindle, which boosts Chiori's defense and skill damage, which is pretty much everything she needs. This weapon is quite good, but scales worse with defense buffs like when played with Goro. And then the last weapon I'm going to recommend in the 4-star list is going to be the Festering Desire. The energy recharge substat is a little wasted since Chiori's burst is not that important, but the boost to her skill damage and crit rate are very welcome. Unfortunately, both of these are old weapons that new players will not have, which severely hurts her weapon selection. And then for those of you who play without Furina and also play with a shielder or consistent healer, the Harbinger of Dawn is going to be your final 3-star option. This option actually isn't bad just because it's a good stat stick, but it does have low base stats and also has a very restrictive HP passive, which does make it impossible to use in certain teams. The crit value alone does make this weapon outperform even the Cinnabar Spindle in many situations though, so if you have none of the previously mentioned options and can work around the restrictive passive, then don't be afraid to use this. Overall, Chiori is not the best when it comes to weapon selection. Aside from her signature weapon, the rest of her options do fall behind quite far. If you can maintain the passive of the Harbinger of Dawn, I actually recommend it just because it's so low investment friendly, but it's just a bit unfortunate that her 4-star options are pretty bad or limited, which means a lot of players are either going to have to gun for the 5-star and thus waste their pulls, or just settle with the Harbinger of Dawn, which does much less damage. For Chiori's stats, I think she's relatively straightforward for anyone building a DPS. Firstly, regarding her main stats, her Sands should be defense percent, her Goblet should be geo damage, and her Circlet should be crit. More often than not, the Circlet should be crit damage as Chiori already ascends with crit, but you should just use whatever balances your stats the easiest. If you are able to achieve around 200 crit value, you should ideally have over 70 to 80% crit rate with around 140 to 150% crit damage, not including the crit value of the weapon that you are using. Now this account does have slightly subpar artifacts, so obviously I can't match those standards, but that's what you should try to aim for. I do not recommend focusing on energy recharge at all, as Chiori is not reliant on it for damage. Her burst also has a pretty low energy cost, which means that even if you don't focus on energy recharge, she should at least still be able to cast her burst every other rotation. Just focus on her crit stats and defense and you'll be fine. For actual artifact sets, there are going to be 2 main sets I'm going to recommend. First up is going to be the 4-piece Golden Troop. This is generally going to be Chiori's best in slot, as it's just a massive boost to Tamoto's damage, and because Chiori is a split scaling character, having a massive amount of damage percent is going to be very useful since it's universal. I also just feel that this set is more efficient to farm, as it allows you to farm the Marechaussee Hunter at the same time, a set that quite a lot of characters from Fontaine use. And then next up, we have the 4-piece Husk of Opulent Dreams. This universally boosts her damage on all fronts, whether it's her infused normals, her doll, or her burst. Because so much of Chiori's damage comes from her doll, this set will more often than not lose to Golden Troop. However, if you play Chiori on field or have her at C6, this set does become the new BIS. This set can also be obtained from the Strongbox, which means that you don't actually have to farm it manually and can focus your resin on other sets first, which makes it very efficient. As for other artifact sets, I have a hard time recommending anything else, but here are some additional options. If you play with Furina, the Marechaussee Hunter is a viable pick, though this will limit your weapon options, as Chiori's crit rate is going to be overcapped if you also use a crit rate weapon. For those of you who play an on-field Chiori but don't yet have a good Husk set, the 4-piece Nighttime Whispers is also viable, though a lot worse. And then finally, any of the above 2-piece set combinations can work and are fine as well, albeit not very good compared to the 4-piece sets. Chiori's teams are a pretty interesting situation. She is a niche support who is obviously going to benefit the most in teams with Geo partners. Because of Chiori's similarity to Albedo, teams where he was going to be good in will likely be a good place for Chiori as well. The first and most obvious benefit is going to be an Itto team, ideally with Goro, and then your final slot can be your healer or shielder. Zhongli is who I normally pick for my sustainer slot, but any number of characters can also fill this role. Noelle can also be the main DPS of this team, as Itto and Noelle teams are generally quite identical. However, Noelle also does have one big benefit, which is that she allows for Furina to be slotted in very easily due to her being a healer. This means you can also run a team like Noelle, Albedo, Furina, and Chiori. If you have Chiori at C1, you can instead swap Albedo out for a more buff-focused support like Goro as well. This team works surprisingly well, but does require Albedo if Chiori is only at Constellation 0. Aside from Itto and Noelle, Ningguang is also a viable on-field DPS since her Jade Screen is considered a construct as well, but the obvious caveat with this team is that Ningguang herself is not a very good character, and I don't expect most people to have built her, but her team options will be practically identical to Itto's. Then onto the Navia teams. For those of you who only plan to get C0 Chiori, you are going to be very limited in your teammates due to Chiori needing someone who can create geoconstructs. Navia herself and Goro both cannot make geoconstructs, so your best options are going to be either Albedo or Zhongli. Personally, I like Albedo more simply because he offers more damage, but most people do not even have Albedo, which means Zhongli is likely going to be the only option for most of you. This is just the unfortunate nature of Chiori's restrictive kit, not allowing her to properly function with Navia at C0. It's not like you can't play them together though, but you lose so much damage potential that you're just better off running a different team for Navia instead. For those of you who do plan to get Chiori's Constellation 1, she now no longer has the restriction of needing a construct to proc her A1, and so her teams become a lot more flexible. All of Navia's standard supports can be put into the team, such as Bennett, Xiangling, Furina, or you can opt for someone like Goro as well, who can buff both Navia and Chiori. Outside of Geo teams, any team that can work with double Geo, such as a Hu Tao team, can work as well, though obviously Hu Tao has much better team options other than using Chiori, and double Geo teams that don't have a Geo DPS are pretty uncommon. And then lastly, for those of you who want to play an on-field DPS Chiori, I'd first like to mention that I do not recommend this playstyle pre-C6 at all, as her normal attack damage is just too low and the uptime is too short to justify it. That said, a main DPS Chiori does have quite a lot of options if you already have her Constellations. Running her alongside the typical buffing support such as Bennett, Furina, Goro, or even other sub DPSs such as Xingqiu or Yelan will all be fine. So yeah, Chiori is not exactly the most flexible character. As a Geo character and with a restrictive kit, Chiori is quite niche. If you have Itto though, or are willing to go for her Constellations to unlock some of her extra potential, then she definitely will be a good addition to your teams. Okay, let's talk about Chiori's Constellations, which are surprisingly important. Constellation 1. As mentioned multiple times throughout this video, this is arguably going to be Chiori's most important constellation, especially for the Navia players out there. The constellation itself is pretty self-explanatory, but the most important part is that she can now trigger the second Tamoto as well as her A4 passive without the need for Geo constructs, which significantly eases her team comp options. This allows you to run a more damaging team, such as Navia, Chiori, Xiangling, and Bennett, where you previously had to sacrifice Xiangling for someone like Zhongli or Albedo in order to proc the second doll and the A4 passive. This constellation does admittedly feel a bit like bait for Navia players out there, as this is a huge damage increase. So if you want the most out of your Navia team, this is going to be it. I do recommend this constellation over her weapon if you're strictly planning to use her with Navia, but if you don't plan to use her with Navia, I don't recommend pulling the constellation. Constellation 2. This summons a new doll type known as Kinu dolls after using her elemental burst that stay on the field for a short period of time and deal additional damage. It's hard to explain without footage, but basically it's just more dolls, more damage. Constellation 3 and 5 are skill and burst talents respectively. Constellation 4 is basically her Constellation 2 again, but instead of being procced by her burst, it's procced by doing a normal charge or plunge attack with the active character after using her skill. And then Constellation 6. This is the big one for those of you who want to play an on-field Chiori, as this gives defense scaling to her normal attacks, while also bringing her skill cooldown to only 4 seconds, which gives her permanent infusion uptime. This is obviously her most damaging constellation, but is also the most expensive as a byproduct. However, this infusion can still be overridden. If I'm being honest, the only constellations I feel that are very worth pulling are her C1 and her C6. Her C2 and 4 are nice, but at the end of the day, they really are just basic damage increases, and damage is not going to be as important as utility, which her C1 and C6 help her with. If you plan to play her only with Itto, she's perfectly fine at C0, but if you want any other team comps, you may want to consider her C1. For the team showcases, I'll be using Chiori in several different teams, but while the footage is playing, I like to give some of my own personal thoughts on Chiori. I think that at C0, she is quite limited, especially in terms of the teams she can fit in. Her damage is quite good, but the need for Geo constructs makes it very hard for her to play in anything other than an Itto team if you don't also already have Zhongli or Albedo. I know you can also use Geo MC, but at that point you might as well just run a different team because that's just such a big DPS loss. I do feel like this character was designed with her Constellation 1 in mind to force Navia players to have to pull for it. It's a bit unfortunate that she is so limiting, and thus I don't feel like she's a very high priority character to pull. Similar to Albedo, her use case is simply too niche for the majority of players out there looking to up their account value. That's not to say Chiori is not a good unit. She has surprisingly high damage multipliers, and Itto teams also have not had very meaningful upgrades for a very long time now, which makes Chiori a huge welcome for those who either haven't gotten Albedo or want to improve their Geo team. I just think that it's a little bit hard to justify pulling Chiori at this point in time, especially since the second half banners with Nuvilla and Kazuha are so stacked. So if you're looking to pull Chiori, think carefully first if she will impact your account value enough to justify the pulls, or you can just pull her right away because you like the character, which honestly should be the right way to pull anyway. I personally find Chiori very fun to play despite her shortcomings, and thankfully I like the character enough to be able to work around them, though obviously you may have a different experience. But anyways, I hope this guide was useful, and I wish everyone the best of luck building her. May all Chiori wanters be Chiori havers. Check out twitch.tv/DukeKC as well, where I often stream Genshin Impact. Thanks for watching my Chiori guide, and I'll talk to you guys in the next one. Take care.
私が手を引く。